There's so much here that they are giving up and sacrificing by this need to murder us. And that's when I got into these questions and began to actually ask and began to read and discover the Algeria paradigm in which a lot of them live. I went looking for what drives. I literally just asked it very bluntly because it matters, so I don't have time to be politically correct or polite. Are they stupid? What don't they understand? Why do they think this is a good idea? And as I dug in deep to their narrative, I discovered A, they're not stupid. It's old. These are old ideas. This is a 140-year discourse in Arabs, among Palestinian Arabs specifically, in the Arab world generally, and um, and it's still wrong, even though it's deep and old. In 1954, really, truly, cartoonishly simple, Alistair Horn wrote, this British historian wrote a magisterial history of the Algeria War, a savage war for peace, I believe it was called. I recommend it. There have been 1,000 others. The Algeria War produced the Frantz Fanon literature and the anti-colonialist literature that is so very popular in college campuses, elite college campuses in the West today. You want to understand why kids are screaming at Columbia, decolonize Palestine. You need to go back to that Algeria war and you'll understand it. But my point is the influence it had not on, Western elites, but on Palestinians. In 1954, the French had been colonizing Algeria since I believe 1830. They'd been there 124 years already. There was something like 1.5 million French, European, white citizens of France living in Algeria. They were legally constituted as a département of the French Republic. They voted for members of parliament in Paris. And they, of course, didn't give citizenship to the millions, I think it's 5 or 6 million, it might be more than that, of Algerian Muslims in the country. And in 1954, the Algerian Muslim organizations and groups and parties came together in a room and established the National Liberation Front. It's a group of activists, and it slowly grew. It's, again, long story. I'm making it cartoonishly simple. People can, I'm just giving people hooks on which to begin their journey of discovery. But they found in 1954 the National Liberation Front, the FLN, which the letters are flipped because it's in French, and they embark on what is probably the paradigmatic anti-colonial war. And an anti-colonial war, its fundamental strategy is pretty simple. Its fundamental strategy is the idea that a colonialist shows up in your country for some benefit. Let's give that benefit, the value X. The benefit, by the way, could be silver mines, it could be slaves, it could be the territory itself, just expansionism. It could be abstractions like the glory of empire. There are places the Portuguese conquered just in their competition with the Spanish, not because they cared. The British needed Egypt for the canal. It could be any reason that a powerful nation takes over some other territory. Give that benefit that the colonialist perceives the value of X. How do you get rid of them? And the answer of the FLN and other anti-colonial movements modeled on the FLN or that came before the FLN was very simple. You exact a cost that's X plus one. And if the cost is X plus one, they leave. But of course, you're not responsible to the colonialist to be polite. You're responsible to your children to be free as soon as possible. So you don't exact a cost of X plus one. It's never X plus one. The cost you try to exact is X plus 300. Because if the cost is X plus 300, the colonialist leaves sooner. And so anti-colonial wars always tend to horrific brutality because of the X plus 300 logic, not because colonized peoples are crueler than civilized Europeans or any of these kinds of ideas that percolated through, the French discourse and other colonial discourses. And the FLN was brutal, horrific. The terror attacks, gunning down families on the beach, cutting off body parts of random victims, just bombings of cafes. It was a horrific terror war. The French response, bless their hearts, managed to be even more horrific. The estimates of the civilian dead of the French bombings of the villages south of the coastal cities where the FLN would hide Probably one reasonable estimate is probably 500,000 dead Algerian civilians. Some ideological movements in Algeria argue that it was 1.5 million. The French response to the FLN was actually horrific, and the FLN also, really importantly, to understand how this functions and how really smart the anti-colonial struggle was, the strategy was. Um, the FLN lost every single engagement in 8 years and won the war because the pressure that this war created, two things created pressure back in Paris. The first was the terrorism inflicted by the FLN. And the second was the French cruelty that terrorism drew in response. Fundamental to the FLN strategy was goading the French to be cruel to the Algerians. And that toppled the Republic and brought in de Gaulle. That created really deeply revolutionary political change in the France. The profound influence that the FLN had on France itself, on the metropole, was astonishing. And that war ends in 1962 with what is essentially a miracle in the experience of the Algerian Muslim community, which is to say, almost overnight, 1 million people just get on a boat and leave, just like that. They got sick of it. They couldn't do it. They couldn't be killed, and they certainly couldn't kill anymore. And their whole politics had restructured themselves, and the French Republic got out. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, is established 2 years, I think less, I think about 18 months later in Cairo. There's a lot of Arab League politics. There's a lot of factions. There's a lot of debates. There's a lot of ideology. There's a lot of Soviet Union. There's a lot of complexity there that people, again, libraries have been written about. But the fundamental story in that room was Algeria. Algeria becomes, in 1962, this touchstone of anti-colonial. The third world almost invents its identity based on that Algerian moment. And when Arafat would go on to declare a Palestinian state in 1988, he did so in Algiers. When Arafat in 1974 gave a speech in the General Assembly talking about Zionism as colonialism, he was invited to speak by the president of the assembly, who was the president of Algeria, who had been a major figure in the FLN. The connection is conscious. And when the PLO is established in 1964, the PLO is established 3 years before there's an Israeli occupation in the West Bank in Gaza. It's not established to push back the Israeli occupation. There is a military occupation in Gaza and the West Bank, but they're Jordanian and Egyptian, and that's not something the Palestinians ever resisted or fought against. And in fact, the Palestinian elites accepted openly and officially. But the 64 establishment of the PLO was based on the idea that just as the Algerians had been able to kick out the French, so too Palestinians, using anti-colonial methods, could kick out the Israelis. And that's really important to understand. The French were strong. The French had been there a long time. The French were many. And those are reasons not to try. And the Algerians proved that even though the Jews were strong, the Jews were many, and the Jews had been there a long time, it could still be done. And so this terror war, and after 64, there's the hijacking of airplanes. There's massacres like the Ma'alot massacre. Commandos of the PFLP come down from Lebanon, take over a school, and murder 22 kids. That kind of warfare is modeled on Algeria. One of the really interesting arguments that come out of FLN strategy is an argument about the nature of power in a colonialist situation. The colonialist state, by definition, is powerful, right? Just because it's a state that can project itself from its own land to another land. When I declare war on it, it gets more powerful because it sees the crisis and it sends troops from the homeland to the colony. So it'll only ever get more powerful. And under the conditions of colonialist rule, I can never meet it in conventional war. I can never develop the industrial base to face its industrial base because I'm colonized by it. In other words, even best case scenario that I could industrialize quickly if I chose to, I can't under their control. So the colonialists will only ever look powerful and it will remain powerful, 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 and then it will collapse. And I can't from the outside see the collapse. But sometimes I get signals of weakness, signals of collapse that come from within the colonialist structure. And for example, sometimes the French asked for some kind of accommodation or ceasefire. The FLN interpreted those attempts at some temporary halt to fighting or something like that as signals from within the colonialist structure of power as an internal weakness. What's the theory of how the colonialist collapses? You cause them the X+1, right? You cause them more cost than the colony is worth, because a colonialist project fundamentally is an economic project or a power projection project. If you cost more than the value to the colonialist, they'll ultimately roll it up and quit. But also you force them to do things they can't explain. That's their cruelty is critical to your strategy. And then eventually they don't want to anymore. They don't want to pay the cost, the moral cost, the political cost, the financial cost, the diplomatic cost of maintaining that superstructure of power. And so they collapse in 6 different ways, and it happens all at once, and it happens from within, not from you. That's the FLN theory of how you destroy a powerful colonialist.
So
That's what the Second Intifada was. That's the point. The
Keep
Second
going.
Intifada was Palestinian terror organizations that modeled themselves on the FLN, the generation of Hamas leaders, of Fatah leaders, Arafat himself, who are leading the Palestinian cause in 2000. How did they interpret Oslo? How did they interpret the fact that Yitzhak Rabin in 1982, the chief of staff of the Israeli army in 67, the conqueror of the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan, and Sinai, he's the one coming to the Palestinians and saying, let's pull back, let's make some accommodation, let's end the occupation, let's create independence for you. And Barak in 1999, running on an even larger, more magnanimous, more actual statehood platform. Barak, the most decorated soldier in the history of the Israeli military. Barak, the chief of staff of the Israeli army. It matters that he came from within the military establishment to this Palestinian interpretation. What is Oslo if not signals from within the power structure, that the power structure is caving? And what does the FLN do when the power structure caves? It doubles down on its attacks, because the fact that the French asked for a ceasefire means that they sense their vulnerability. That's your only signal of vulnerability. You triple down on the attacks. And so what was the Second Intifada in the minds of the orchestrators of the Second Intifada? The First Intifada was bottom up. Palestinian leaders were as surprised as the Israelis, and they had to pivot to pretend to be in charge of it. The Second Intifada was a planned, organized guerrilla warfare project, really a campaign with leaders, with bank accounts, with planners, with intelligence, with engineers. The Second Intifada was the Palestinian political elite raised on the ideas of Algeria, saying, we've just gotten the signal, now we double down. And so the height of peace was the moment to destroy the peace in 140 suicide bombings. Last test of Arab intentions, Palestinian intentions, and beyond Palestinian intentions in Lebanon and elsewhere wasn't in 2000 or 2000 to 2003, the Second Intifada. The test continued, because who won that election in 2001 at the collapse of the left, when 17 points of the electorate disappeared on us? A man named Ariel Sharon. He was the head of the opposition, head of the Likud party at the time, a brilliant military commander in his past. And Sharon becomes prime minister while buses are blowing up. The city buses that are blowing up in the morning in the city of Jerusalem in 2001 are full of kids. And so the idea that these attacks, it's a statistic, it's a Wikipedia article. No, this is actually the lived experience of people convinced that the other side wants to mass murder our children. And they're convinced of it because the other side tried to mass murder our children. So Ariel Sharon becomes prime minister under those conditions. And there's a debate in the Israeli strategic elite about what to do. And there's actually a voice coming out of army intelligence and some other places that says that it's not clear that we can stop it with military solutions, that you need a political solution. And by, I think, December of 2003, the Second Intifada is basically over. I mean, people can look up the dates of each bombing, but if I'm not mistaken, it's not even a bombing every 2 months by then. And Ariel Sharon gets up at the end of the year, late December 2003, on national television, and he gives this astonishing speech in which he announces what would come to be called the disengagement from Gaza. And his basic rationale in interviews, and some of it's in the speech, and some of it other people have said in his name, his basic rationale is we can't rule over them forever. We learned in the Second Intifada that we can't pull out and have them reciprocate that with the one thing we want from them, which is peace. Why can't they? Political ideologies, political dysfunction of their elites, whatever, who cares why? I'm not going to socially engineer them. I don't know how to fix them. They can't. So what do we do? And Sharon's answer was, we get the hell out for our interest. And if anybody crosses the border, we shoot them. That's it. We separate. They're free, free to collapse, free to thrive, free to do whatever the hell they want. And we're free of them. And everybody is thus free of this terrible situation where we control another people. And in August of 2005, the disengagement is carried out. What's really important for people to understand was that in real time, it was incredibly popular. What the Israeli public thought, and the Israeli public's a big place with many different opinions, but what I would say the majority of the Israeli public believed about the disengagement from Gaza when it was happening in August of 2005 was that the Israeli left had tried to end the occupation, but with a ridiculous and inappropriate amount of optimism, assumed that what it was trying to do was what Palestinian leaders were trying to do. The right, and that had failed miserably and disastrously in rivers of blood. The right was now going to do much more responsibly the same exact thing the left can't do because the left are a bunch of Pollyannas. That was the basic perception. And it was immensely popular. And the day after the disengagement from Gaza, when the literal gates to the fence were closed by a soldier and Israel no longer controls any part of Gaza, there isn't even a blockade at that point. The blockade comes in 2 years later when Hamas takes over Gaza. That end of Israeli presence in Gaza made Sharon more popular the day after than he was the day before. He is by now everybody's grandpa. He is one of the most popular prime ministers in Israel's history at this moment. He is so popular, and Likud is so unpopular and mired in a whole bunch of corruption scandals, and it's a lot of detail there that doesn't matter, that he decides to leave Likud. Netanyahu is back in Likud leading a rebellion against him. He decides to leave Likud, and I believe it's November of 2005. In August, he pulled out of Gaza. In November, he leaves Likud and establishes a party called Kadima. He then has a massive stroke. He is enormously obese. He is very unhealthy. He's in his 70s. He has a massive stroke. He's basically brain dead, and the country goes to an election in early 2006. The number 2 guy in Kadima, who came with Sharon from Likud, his name is Ehud Olmert. Apologies again for being so deep in the weeds. When we come out of it, things will be visible that we're not when you don't go through the weeds. Ehud Olmert, unpopular, but number 2 in Kadima with Sharon, formerly Kudnik, is now running for prime minister. And before the election, he actually gives a speech in which he says on public television, I think it's 2 weeks before the election, he talks about this idea of withdrawing from the West Bank. Sharon, when he pulled out of Gaza, also took down 4 small settlements in the northern West Bank, in northern Samaria. And Olmert says that was the goal. The goal was then to do the same disengagement, unilateral, in the ways that serve our interests. Screw them. They can't reciprocate. We're not waiting for them. We're going to pull out of the West Bank. And he would come to call this the convergence plan, Tochnit Eitkensut, which is like the ingathering plan. And in English, he translated a convergence plan. Terrible names. Israeli prime ministers, whether it's disengagement or convergence, they'll use any word they can to not use the word withdrawal. It's really kind of adorable. But the convergence plan is known to the public that he wants this, that he thinks this way on election day. And I often, when going through some of this history, ask people, ask groups that I'm talking to, you have Netanyahu back in control of Likud after the bloody collapse of Oslo, a man who argued Oslo would collapse in bloodshed. And you have Olmert, fresh, this deeply unpopular prime minister. By the way, he once ran for Likud leader in the primary. He got 2% of the Likud primary vote. Olmert is now head of Kadima, and Olmert is talking about withdrawals from the West Bank. Who wins that election in 2006? And I always get 90% raising their hand for Netanyahu and 2% hesitantly for Olmert because they figure there's probably a trick here. And of course, the answer is that Olmert wins the 2006 election. In 2006, if a right winger is saying it and Sharon wanted it, it is still plausible to talk about withdrawals from territory. Olmert forms his government, I think in March of 2006. He forms it with the Labour Party. He gives the Labour Party the defense ministry, which is really significant. The left that can no longer win an election is now in charge of the military that will pull out of the West Bank. In other words, the people who believe in a West Bank withdrawal will be the ones carrying out the West Bank withdrawal. And the government exists. I'm trying to do math on the fly. I apologize, but this is all so easy to look up. I believe the government is in existence 10 weeks. When Hamas in Gaza carry out in June of 2006, we are out 10 months, the first tunnel operation that Hamas has ever carried out. They dig a tunnel under the border, they pop up on the Israeli side, they kill 2 Israeli soldiers, they kidnap a third. His name is Gilad Shalit, and they drag him into the dungeons of Gaza. There is now a shooting war on the Gaza border. The Israeli army is racing in to try and rescue him. And on July 12th, 2006, in the midst of that shooting war in Gaza, Hezbollah in the north carry out its first cross-border attack. They kill 4 soldiers, they kidnap 2 others, Eldad Regev and Ehud Goldwasser. We start to see this systemic sort of idea of kidnapping come into the strategic and tactical arsenal of the enemy. Hezbollah is the exact same story. In May 2000, Ehud Barak gave the order, after 18 years in Lebanon, to pull out of Lebanon. It was our Afghanistan, right? We went in chasing after terrorists. We got bogged down there for 18 years. And when we pulled out, the very terrorists, well, in Lebanon's case, different terrorists. In Afghanistan's case, the exact same terrorists. But still, a terrorist group then takes over the vacuum from what, that we left behind. 6 years after Israel unilaterally withdraws from Lebanon, Hezbollah now carries out the first cross-border attack, killing and kidnapping soldiers. And now Ehud Olmert has a problem. And maybe I'll end the story with this problem. Because this is where the lesson that Israelis learned in the Second Intifada becomes almost unassailable truth in the Israeli psyche. The problem Ehud Olmert has is that he has just argued, and he argued it before an election, publicly. He even at one point said, don't tell me I didn't tell you. The right had accused Sharon of carrying out the Gaza disengagement, but when he was elected back in 2003, he didn't say that he wanted to pull out. He ran as a right winger. So Olmert says, I don't want anybody telling me you didn't know. Olmert's problem is the 2 places we had just pulled out of, unilaterally, Gaza and South Lebanon, we were now in a shooting war with those places. When Barak pulls out of Lebanon in 2000, Israelis come to him, and there's this discussion in the public in Israel in which Israelis say to him, who do you think's going to take over when we leave? Who do you think fills a vacuum of power in the Middle East today, right? When President Obama ordered the American troops out of Iraq, who filled that vacuum of power? There's a direct line to ISIS, right? That's not even an accusation. It's not a criticism of Obama. I'm not sure that was a bad policy decision at all. If after that much money and that much blood spent in a place for so long, when you pull out, ISIS fills the gap in the vacuum, it wasn't working. I'm not accusing Obama of anything. I'm just saying when there's a vacuum of power in the Middle East today, going through the crisis it's going through, who fills it? Not Jeffersonian Democrats, right? Like you say. If we leave Lebanon, Hezbollah will take over. And people, when Sharon pulls out of Gaza, that same argument is made to Sharon. And people say, who's going to take over Gaza when we leave? The one liberal in the entire Palestinian parliament, the Salam Fayyad, was going to take over. The people are going to take over Hamas. And Sharon and Barak's answers, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but their answers were basically, look, we pull out to the international border. We don't pull out gently or politely or because it's, we're making peace. We don't believe in peace because they don't believe in peace. We don't believe they can reciprocate peace. We pull out to a defensible border. They come at us. We shoot them. Believe me, I'm Ehud Barak, former chief of staff of the IDF, most decorated soldier in the history of Israel. Sharon is this brilliant military commander, ruthless commander. People should look up his exploits in '73 in the southern front. And Sharon says, if they think this is weakness, they're going to test us, and then we're going to have to explain to them it's not weakness, explain in air quotes, and then they will understand. Don't worry, Israelis, we will have international backing because we've pulled out to an international border. Don't worry, this is defensible. And that's when Olmert's problem is clear. Barak and Sharon offered this promise. We will restore deterrence if the enemy interprets our withdrawal as weakness. And Olmert has to restore deterrence. But Olmert has to restore deterrence urgently and more powerfully for one huge reason. He wants to pull out of the West Bank. Right. That's his legacy. That's his fundamental idea. And the West Bank is an order of magnitude more dangerous than Gaza and Lebanon, because the West Bank is the mountain range overlooking the coastal plain where most Israelis live. The West Bank shrinks us down to 9 miles wide, like I said. If we pull out of the West Bank, somebody can stand in the West Bank with a weapon they can carry on their literal shoulder, for example, an 88 millimeter mortar, and shut down using that little tube our major international airport, and then walk away. Just literally get in a car and drive away, calm as can be. If we pull out of the West Bank and it goes the way Gaza went when Hamas took over in 2007, we have to retake it. I'm not even saying this is not a moral discussion. This is a strategic, tactical one. If we pull out of the West Bank and it turns into a kind of non-sovereign, non-state entity that takes over the functions of state entities and can declare war, but can't be made responsible because it's not actually the government, meaning Hamas in Gaza / Hezbollah in Lebanon. If that happens to the West Bank, we have to go back in just to reopen our major highways and cities. And so the West Bank can't go the way Gaza went. It has to be safe or it can't be done. Literally can't be done. It'll be reversed with terrible bloodshed. And nobody knows how to prevent that or to stop that from happening. And so Olmert has to show that he can restore deterrence in Gaza and Lebanon in order to be able to pull out of the West Bank. And he tries. It's called the Second Lebanon War. Every single bridge in Lebanon was destroyed. Half of Beirut lost electricity. I remember one scene on TV where Fouad Senor, the prime minister of Lebanon, as close as the Arab world comes to an actual liberal, is sitting at the Security Council, I believe is in New York, addressing the Security Council, and he wept, actual tears. This is not, some like Bill Clinton on the campaign trail weeping. An Arab politician weeping on television is a different cultural moment. Lebanon suffered terribly. Olmert smashed everything he could find that could possibly be connected to Hezbollah. It didn't work. The Israeli civilian experience, what did not experience the smashing of Lebanon, did not experience Olmert's, powerful response to Hamas. What Israeli civilians experienced in 2006 was that hundreds of thousands of them became displaced people, was that cities were bombarded by thousands upon thousands upon thousands of rockets, and nothing on earth could stop it. There was no Iron Dome. The north and south of Israel didn't have enough bomb shelters. There has since been a multi-billion shekel project to literally build towers of bomb shelters attached to old apartment buildings and with a door cut open so that every old apartment now has a new bomb shelter. If you drive through the city of Sderot, just a few miles off the Gaza border, you will literally see new rooms, towers of new bedrooms attached to old apartment buildings. Israel has built a bomb shelter in every apartment because if you have 14 seconds warning of a siren and you have two little kids and you're on the third floor, you're not getting to that bomb shelter in the street. And so Israelis fled and entire cities were emptied and nothing Israel did. Hezbollah was proud of this. Hezbollah said publicly in Hebrew on YouTube, YouTube was around then, right? I remember the videos. I think it was YouTube. Said publicly, nothing you do will stop the missile fire. And the terrible tragedy, not so much for us as for our enemies, was that the Israeli public came to believe them. They're undeterrable, Israelis believe. You cannot deter Hamas. You cannot deter Hezbollah. They are not sensitive to their own people's suffering. And therefore, you cannot pull out of the West Bank. And so any potential support for a West Bank withdrawal collapsed. And really, it's important that the fundamental point here is that it didn't collapse on the right, which already had reasons, security, sometimes religious, sometimes other kinds of ideological, not to pull out of the West Bank. It collapsed on the left that was desperate to pull out of the West Bank for 100 different reasons, all of them good. And they no longer thought after 2006, confirmed again and again and again in different ways, that even the right... I'll stop with this sentence. What do Israelis actually believe? People ask me that a lot, and I don't go on CNN to convey the 5-minute Israeli. I never get, if you get 90 seconds, you're lucky. But you have to walk through it, because what Israelis actually think is utter total confusion and frustration. They think, and again, this is their experience. This is not the totality of objective history. I don't know the totality of objective history. But what the Israeli Jewish mainstream believes happened to it, what it experienced, was that it tried. And it tried and tried again. It reorganized its entire politics around this attempt. It fought an internal political civil war for this attempt. And every single move in that direction ended in rivers of blood because Palestinian ideological elites, or Hezbollah ideological elite, Lebanese, certain parts of Lebanese ideological elites, were fighting in a whole different universe, an entirely different kind of war, and could not reciprocate an Israeli withdrawal with peace. And the West Bank is dangerous in a way that Gaza and South Lebanon, dangerous though they may be, if they are controlled by Hamas or Hezbollah, could never be. And that is what the Israeli left, which still exists. These people didn't evaporate. They just don't vote that way anymore. And not only that, we have these fascinating polls that tell us that when you ask them conditionals, in other words, you say, should there be a Palestinian state? Huge numbers of Israeli Jews say no. I mean, 80% say no. And then you say, well, what if it were safe? And then suddenly 60% say sure. And then you say to them, will it ever be safe? 80% say no. That's where they're at. And that's the fundamental Israeli story. And that's also why they're totally immune to international pressure on this point. Because they actually believe that every place they pull out of, the Palestinian ideological factions will use to murder their children. How are you going to pressure the Israelis if you can sanction the Israelis or boycott the Israelis or ostracize the Israelis or turn anti-Semitic and hate Jews anywhere you find it? Whatever you think you're doing to pressure the Israelis, Hamas lies on the other side, pressuring them in the other direction, because it absolutely convinced them for a generation that there is nothing they can do to pull out, that Hamas won't turn into terrible bloodshed and the murder of their children. October 7 was Hamas arguing, essentially, if you understand that history, the strategic history, arguing essentially that the problem so far is that we haven't sufficiently sacrificed on the altar of Algeria. And Hamas engineered painstakingly the destruction of Gaza. The tunnel networks, they've said this. This isn't an Israeli conspiracy theory. They have argued this. The Israeli, not a single civilian, there are 500 kilometers of tunnels in Gaza. It's the single biggest thing Palestinians have ever built. Hamas bent the entire Gazan economy to this tunnel project. And they built nothing else for 17 years. And the fundamental purpose of this tunnel project is that when Hamas begins the war it planned to begin, the only way the enemy can get to Hamas is to cut through the cities. There's simply no other way to get to those tunnels. And in 13 months of war, not a single civilian has been allowed to step foot in a single tunnel for their protection. The point of this war is, A, to double down on Second Intifada traumatic terrorizing of the Israelis, and B, in doubling down on the Israeli response, military response, paying for Palestinian civilians that empties the Israelis of their purpose, like it did to the French colonialists, like the Mau Mau rebellion did to the British in Kenya, like Gandhi in his exact opposite strategy, but it was based around robbing the British of their excuse for their for their use of force, for their violence, for their imposition of oppression. By forcing an Israeli strategy to get Hamas, by forcing the Israelis to decide that any cost there is no cost they won't pay to get Hamas, and then making that cost catastrophic for Palestinians, you impose all of those Algerian costs that the Algerians thought about on the French from all the different layers, the forcing French cruelty against Algeria, forcing Israeli cruelty against Gaza. That's the strategy. It is a doubling and tripling and quadrupling and whatever goes beyond quadrupling, quintupling of that strategy by Sinwar for this conflict. And I have argued this since 2012. I wrote a piece in 2014 about the Hamas Gaza strategy being the Algeria strategy. And that piece went insanely viral. Hundreds of thousands of people read an essay that was 3,000 words that after something goes viral, you look back at it and you're very upset that you got something wrong in it, things like that, right? That's not a piece that should have gone viral. That was long and plotting and complicated, but it explained why Hamas isn't stupid and that people really are hungering for. What's the deep, rich, serious thinking? Hamas are not, Sinwar's a psychopath and probably actually a sociopath, literally, but all Hamas isn't psychopaths. I mean, all Hamas did this. And so many Gazans still find dignity in that version of the story. What's going on? And the answer is it was a doubling down on Algeria. And I have argued that it won't work. It won't work. And the reason it won't work is the ways in which the Israelis are unlike the French. And the biggest way that the Israelis are unlike the French is that they have no France.
Yeah.
Well, there's no France to go back to. But there are many other ways that the Israelis are unlike the French. They come from the Arab world. If the PLO in 1964, looking at Algeria, drawing inspiration, modeling its strategy on the FLN strategy, had noticed that in the immediate aftermath of the FLN kicking out the French, they kicked out another group. They kicked out the Jews, a Jewish community that had been in Algeria since before Algerians spoke Arabic. And the Jews could not live in Algeria under the FLN. And that's why Israel, where those Algerian Jews largely live, is immune to the anti-French strategy. Because we don't have a France and we don't even have an Algeria
to go back to.
And so what happens when you launch an anti-colonial strategy of brutalizing warfare meant to draw cruelty to your own side as well, against an enemy that in the specific characteristics needed for the strategy to work, it doesn't share those characteristics with colonial. You want to still call me colonialist as an epithet? You want to still call me colonialist because you don't like me? You want to call me colonialist because in some philosophical sense, there's some version of this in which I'm a colonialist? I don't care about this moralizing language. By the way, none of us care, not Palestinians, not Israelis. There are polls that tell us that 90% of Palestinians think the Israelis want to exterminate them, and 90% of Israelis tell us Palestinians want to exterminate them. No Israeli and no Palestinian cares about the moral emotions of foreigners. It's just not registering in their psyche. And it shouldn't register in their psyche because it looks to them detached and ridiculous. The idea that you foreigners are living out your moral fantasies on us while we have everything literally at stake, which is how people are experiencing this, means that none of this foreign emotion matters. Nothing will stop the Israelis and nothing will stop the Palestinians because everything is at stake. But they will still fail, and they will fail because of all the ways in which we are not French colonialism.
Okay.
And that's the great tragedy, that they are destroying Palestine, not Israel, in this refusal to understand us on our own terms. I think that if they knew our history, if they listened to your and my podcast a year ago, then Hamas's catastrophic, cataclysmic mistake would become obvious. And I try to teach Palestinians our story in as much as any Palestinian will listen to me, which is not very much. There is a profound gap between the way that the West looks at us and the way we look at ourselves. And it is a gap that I think is rooted to some significant extent, maybe even a very significant extent, in the gap between the Jews of the West and the Jews of Israel. We have today two Jewish civilizations, and they're basically the two Jews who survived the 20th century, the English-speaking Jew and the Hebrew-speaking Jew. In the 20th century, you either learned Hebrew, learned English, or died. That's the story of the Jews. Every time I say something like that, French Jews raise their hand and get angry at me. But they're the third largest Jewish community after Israel and America. But French Jews are the exception that proves the rule because French Jewry is 90% Sephardi. They're 90% from North Africa. After the Holocaust, France is refilled with Jews because North Africa empties of its Jews. See, for example, Algeria. And so they're the exception to this rule that absolutely proves the rule. And they've had radically different histories. The story of American Jews, who are the lens through which America and larger parts of the West and the left see Israel, is a story of the promise of liberalism coming true in astonishing ways. When the Jews land in America, these 2.5 million refugees who flee 1,300 pogroms and 250,000 dead and horrific oppression and laws against them in the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the new Romania and all of these different things that are happening in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to Jews. And Europe is slowly but very, very clearly becoming literally uninhabitable to Jews, and millions are fleeing, and the vast majority flee to the United States. And these 2.5 million Jews land in America, and they discover, for the very first time in Jewish history, it had never happened before, no Jew had ever seen this before, a country that actually, genuinely, truly believed that they belonged to it. It wasn't that the Jews fantasized, as in Germany for certain periods, that they could become Germans, but the Germans never had that fantasy about the Jews. It wasn't that the Jews thought maybe there was integration in our future in the Russian Empire, and the Russians never, ever, not even under communist rule when that was the official ideology, but still it said Jew in your passport. Jews could never be Russian, according to the Russians, and Jews could never be Germans, according to the Germans, and Bulgarians, and by the way, Iraqis. But the Jews could suddenly be Americans, and all America thought so. And that's weird. That is an absolute unique exception. It happened a little bit also in the rest of the English-speaking world. It happened in Canada as well.
It's an aberration.
It's an aberration, and it felt to the Jews of America like an end to Jewish history, to the Jewish history of pain. And that's one reason that American Jews stopped teaching history about 5 generations ago. And you today have young people on your college campuses who think that the entire experience of millions of refugees and vast pain and hundreds of pogroms and death tolls into the 6 figures, the 20th century is the bloodiest century in Jewish history without the Holocaust. And all of that history has been reduced essentially to fiddler in the American Jewish imagination because they consciously decided to stop teaching history because history had ended because America was the answer. American Jews are home in a homeland that's not quite America, it's American liberalism. And that existence in that homeland is a radically new Jewish world, Jewish community, Jewish psyche. The promise of liberalism came true so utterly and profoundly that it created a whole new kind of Jew. Who are the Israelis? The Israelis are the exact mirror image opposite of that. They're the Jews that went through the 20th century because when America put up its quota laws in 21 and 1924, and they're the Jews who couldn't get in. And they couldn't get into Canada and Britain and Brazil and Australia. All the nations of the world in the 20s and 30s, for various reasons, put up quota laws and immigration laws. South Africa passed 4 distinct immigration laws to keep the Jews out, including one in 1937 targeting German Jews. The whole point was Europe deals with the Jewish problem. We don't deal with the Jewish problem. Jews became undeportable. That was the Nazi problem. They wanted to get rid of the Jews by deportation. They couldn't. Nobody would take them at a certain point. And so they had to kill them. That was how the Nazis thought of it. And these immigration laws corralled the Jews into the gas chambers. But even after the Holocaust, these people who would become Israelis still watched as the world wouldn't take them in. I was in a high school AP American history class in Wisconsin in 1998 or so. And my teacher talked about how the British liberated Bergen-Belsen and the American soldiers liberated Buchenwald and Dachau. And then the books closed, and the next day we talked about the Vietnam War.
Yeah, sure.
And I raised my hand and I said, wait a second. You think that the American troops liberated Bergen-Belsen and Dachau and Buchenwald, the American and British troops? The Jews are still living there 3 years later. What does liberated mean? Truman begged Congress to let them in, and Congress refused. The quotas were never lifted after the world knew everything there is to know about Auschwitz. Nobody on earth, the International Refugee Organization, brought dozens of governments to the camps to set up booths, interview the million DPs who couldn't go home. And every single non-Jew, 750,000, was given citizenship in new countries and taken away. And after the IRO closes up shop and shuts down its booths and leaves, the last 250,000 DPs, by the end of 1946, I believe it was, every last one of them is a Jew. The Jews watched as the world carefully sifted after the Holocaust, the entirety of the West, carefully sifted through the last survivors. When Congress shuts the doors in the 1920s, there's potentially 8 million Jews who could flee Europe to America. Nobody wants 8 million Jews. That's way too many. But the last 250,000 of a shattered remnants, the Nazis lost to the Allies, but they didn't lose the war on the Jews. They destroyed European Jewry. And that last 250,000 had no place to go. When did the DP camps start emptying out in large numbers? In May 1948. And those DPs are a quarter of the IDF. And so what is the Israeli Jewish experience of history? And this is exactly speaks to your question of living on our sword, of fighting forever and ever. The world is capable of watching you die, shrugging and turning away. And the best of the world, the most moral, and the American empire that created the greatest happiness and prosperity in the history, the Pax Americana is a period everybody's going to miss, especially the people who complained about it the most. And that part of the world, that great America that the Jews who did make it in, they actually allowed to become Americans in a way that there is no compliment paid in the history of the world to any nation on this earth than the Jewish experience of America. But any Jew who didn't get in watched America sit and look at them as they died. And the last living Jews in the Eastern Hemisphere. I give a lot of college talks, university talks over the last year on American college campuses and in Britain a little bit, in Canada and Australia. And I think it was at GW in DC. And a kid raises his hand and he says to me, everyone on campus is anti-Zionist. The professors are anti-Zionist and the students, my friends aren't my friends anymore, and I can't get a date. This, by the way, is a very smart kid because he's waving the flag of Zionist victim of anti-Zionism in a room full of kids who self-selected to come to hear me speak. So this was the right crowd to look for a date. But I tried to convey to this kid exactly this gap. And so I said to him, look, I'm the idiot Israeli in the room. What's an anti-Zionist? And he says, well, the anti-Zionist is the person who thinks that Israel should never have been founded. And I said, well, but every other Jew in the Eastern Hemisphere is dead. There's a few, but statistically, that's the basic truth. What's the argument? Is the argument that we should also be dead? You wish 8 million Israeli Jews who live today should have died then? Say so out loud. Or is the argument that the world should have given us other options, somewhere else to go, to flee to? Well, I agree with that. If that's anti-Zionist, I'm an anti-Zionist. But are there any other options? What are the other options? You're either genocidal, ignorant of the history, so you think the Jews had a choice, Zionist, or what? What's the fourth option? And that's the gap between the American Jewish perception and the Israeli Jewish perception, which is to say, in the United States, Zionist is a word that is believed to be to convey a kind of ideological option. In other words, you can be six kinds of Jews, right? You can be Orthodox and conservative and Reform and Buddhist and communist and Democrat voting and Republican voting and mountain biking. You can be a mountain biking Jew. You can be all different kinds of Jews. One of them is Zionist. Among the 16 ideological options you have for your Jewishness, you can be Zionist Jew. Ew, yuck, Zionist Jew is icky, don't be that one. That's what people think they're saying in America when they say anti-Zionist. But what is the Israeli understanding of anti-Zionist? Because they lived that history that American Jews don't even learn. They actually lived through the 20th century in a way America saved its Jews from ever having to live through. Zionist just literally means survived. And I say that because to those DPs who are a quarter of the IDF in 1948, if they don't have this place, they don't have any place on earth, and the entirety of the world proved it to them. When Truman sends Earl Harrison, the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, I think we mentioned him in the last
talk. Talked about him, yeah.
He gives this poll, and I want to re-mention it if people haven't heard it. It's a year ago. Yeah. He gives this poll at one camp.
DPs meaning displaced persons, people who after the war, quote, have no place to go.
Right. So he comes to one camp and he gives a poll in which he says to people, where do you want to go? I don't know if I can get you there. We have president wants to take you into America. Congress won't let him. I don't know what we're going to do, but where do you want to go? And 90% right on the first line, Palestina. And 90% right on the second line, Palestina. And Harrison is annoyed because apparently Jews don't know how surveys work. And so he gives them a new survey in which he says, other than Palestine, where do you want to go? And 25% write crematorium. They got the message. They got the message. The world gave them a message. They finally understood it. So for an Israeli, and this is something American Jews really struggle to understand and imagine, and it is so fundamental. Living on our sword is redemption. We stopped dying when we started having the great and profound right that our ancestors never had. And so they just died quietly, while others tried to tell a story about their deaths that ennobled the others. Our ancestors did not get to live on their sword. We do. That's the privilege. That's the change in history. That's what Israel means. Our enemies can't scare us out of here. War came on October 7, and left-wingers went to Gaza just like right-wingers, because Gaza had convinced them, Hamas had convinced them, that there aren't any other paths. I don't argue this is truth, all of it, all told, objective and perfect. This is what those Israelis think is happening to them, and they're not stupid. And if you're going to tell them they're wrong, you have to start with what they know. You can't start not knowing what they know and think you have something to say, because you don't have anything to say. For Israelis, this moment, this period, this pain, this frustration, this agony, this is the best version of history available to us, and thank God we get to live in it, because wow, do our enemies suffer. It used to be that the Jews suffered and the enemies did not. Israel didn't make Jews invincible. It just made their blood very, very costly. And that's enough. And that's what happens when you go through the 20th century. That there is no reason that Iran would want to destroy Israel. It has no interests in Israel, it has no border with Israel. And it doesn't give a shit about Palestinian rights. It doesn't even give a shit about Iranian rights. The Iranian regime wants to destroy Israel because of some wackadoodle, insane, vast, I explain it very empathetically. I have a whole class on it, but that's not the point. The point is because of this vast restorationist, redemptive religious vision. And for the first time in the history of Jews, the Jews can hurt them more than they can hurt us. And that's it. That's the thing you just asked me about, as if it was the bad scenario, feels to Israelis like the good news.